Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're going to unpack how a totally spontaneous, ground-level decision completely upended the Grand Allied strategy during the final months of World War II. It's a fascinating look at what happens when rigid military planning violently collides with split-second battlefield bravery. So let's dive right in. Picture this. It's the spring of 1945. The Allies have fought through France, they survived that brutal winter in the Ardennes, and they've finally reached the German border. But standing right between them and the absolute heart of Nazi Germany was the mighty Rhine River. I mean, this river was wide, it was fast-moving, and it was heavily defended. It was quite literally the final natural barrier protecting the German heartland. Here is how we'll map out this turning point today. We're going to cover 1. The Rhine's last bridge. 2. Operation Lumberjack. 3. The Remagen gamble. 4. First across the river. 5. Hodges shifts the strategy. And finally, 6. Defending the bridgehead. All right, Section 1, the Rhine's last bridge. Let's look at the strategic surprise on the Western Front. So, the Supreme Allied Command actually had a very strict, rigid game plan for crossing the Rhine. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery was slated to make the main crossing up in the north with Operation Plunder, which was this incredibly massive, meticulously planned amphibious and airborne assault. Down south, though, the U.S. First Army was just handed Operation Lumberjack. This was strictly a supporting effort. Their orders were simply to clear the west bank of the river and pivot south. They were absolutely not supposed to cross. And you have to remember, the First Army troops weren't exactly fresh legs waiting for an opportunity. To really understand the macro picture, look at what they'd been through over the past 7 months. From the breakout in Normandy, fighting through the absolute meat grinder of the Hergen Forest, to holding the line at Elsenborn Ridge during the Battle of the Bulge. They had been in continuous, brutal combat just to reach this riverbank. By March 1945, these men were completely exhausted, but they were a highly elite, battle-hardened force. Moving on to Section 2, Operation Lumberjack, and the rigid orders of a quiet general. Now, I want to zero in on Lieutenant General Courtney Hodges. He's the true focal point of our macro-level story today. Hodges wasn't as flashy or media-conscious as his peers, guys like George Patton or Montgomery. He wasn't really making those grand, sweeping headlines. But Hodges was a brilliant, meticulous strategist who had expertly guided the First Army through some of the bloodiest campaigns in Europe. And right now, his focus was entirely on executing his specific, limited objective. Because of that, Hodges' subordinate, IC Course Commander Major General John Milliken, issued rigid orders that cascaded all the way down to the 9th Armored Division. The directives were absolute. Move south along the western bank, cross the Ahr River, and connect with Patton's forces near Koblenz. And the Golden Rule? Under no circumstances were they to attempt a major crossing of the Rhine. The plan was set in stone. Which brings us to Section 3, the Remagen gamble. Here's where those rigid orders crash headfirst into battlefield reality. Imagine being Brigadier General William Hoge on March 7th. You emerge from the woods, and there it is, the Ludendorff Railroad Bridge at Remagen, totally intact. I mean, it was a moment of sheer disbelief. The Allies had been bombing bridges up and down the Rhine for months. Finding one standing was almost unbelievable. So, Hoge faces an agonizing choice. Does he obey his strict orders to turn south, or does he risk a drumhead court-martial to seize an impossible prize? Talk about bold battlefield leadership. Hodge makes the incredible micro-level gamble to openly disobey Third Corps' orders. Knowing the Germans could detonate that bridge at literally any second, and knowing his own superiors were actively ordering him to march in the exact opposite direction, he halts his southward movement right then and there. He orders an immediate attack to capture the span. Section 4. First across the river. Let's zoom all the way into the desperate dash of Company A. Okay, let this number sink in for a second. 1,306. That is the exact number of feet, nearly 400 meters, that American soldiers had to sprint across a bridge, fully rigged with explosives. And they weren't just taking a jog. They were running through direct, heavy fire from German positions on the opposite bank. Sergeant Alexander Drabik is the guy who led the charge. And the irony here is just incredible. He was a butcher from Ohio before the war, and here he is, sprinting headlong into heavy machine gun and 20mm anti-aircraft fire. He was running so hard, he actually lost his helmet during the dash, but he didn't stop. He pushed through the explosions and the shrapnel to become the very first American soldier to cross the Rhine River. Right on his heels was Lieutenant Karl Timmerman, While the infantry was scrambling to clear the far bank of hostile snipers, the engineers were out there performing absolute miracles. German explosive charges actually went off at one point, blowing a massive crater in the bridge, but the primary demolitions somehow failed. The engineers were desperately cutting wires and removing 1,000 pounds of unexploded charges by hand. Against all odds, they cemented an astonishing tactical victory. All right, Section 5. Hodges shifts the strategy. Let's look at how you adapted entire field army on the fly. Zooming back out to the macro level, word of this insubordinate but highly successful capture reaches General Hodges back at headquarters. And this normally quiet, reserved commander was just completely elated. He realized instantly what this meant. Seizing an intact bridge over the final barrier into Germany, it was a stroke of luck that could shorten the entire war by weeks, maybe even months. And this is where Hodges truly shines as a brilliant commander. He didn't just sit around waiting for the rigid master plan to catch up. He got quick authorization from General Eisenhower, and then Hodges rapidly pivoted his entire grand strategy, funneling up to 9 divisions into this tiny foothold. And he was ruthless about it, too. Frustrated by the slow pace of the initial exploitation, Hodges actually relieved the rigid General Milliken of command, bringing in General Van Fleet to aggressively push forces across before the Germans could crush them. Finally, Section 6, defending the bridgehead, because capturing the bridge was really just the beginning. You have to realize, the Ludendorff Bridge was heavily crippled by those partial demolitions. It was literally groaning and creaking ominously under the immense weight of American Sherman tanks rolling across it. So combat engineers were thrust into this terrifying, desperate race against a ticking clock to reinforce the structure before the enemy could react. And man, the enemy reaction was fierce. The Germans threw absolutely everything they had at this single choke point to bring the bridge down. Astonishingly, they even launched V-2 rockets from the Netherlands, which, by the way, was the only time in the entire war these terror weapons were used on a tactical target inside Germany. They sent explosive-laden barges down the river, they deployed Special Operations frogmen to sabotage the supports, all on top of relentless artillery and air raids. But under all that fire, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers showed sheer, absolute ingenuity. To protect the crossing, they built temporary pontoon bridges right alongside the main span. Because the Rhine's current was so incredibly fast, they had to fabricate massive 6 to 8 ton anchors out of steel panels and rock, just to keep protective nets in place against the floating mines. They even brought in highly secret, powerful searchlights to illuminate the river valley, literally blinding enemy bombers at night. It was an unbelievable, grueling 10-day effort. Between March 8th and 16th, the engineers somehow managed to push 25,000 men and 5 full divisions across the river. But eventually, the structural damage and those continuous bombardments were just too much. On March 17th, the Ludendorff Bridge tragically collapsed into the Rhine. It took the lives of 28 brave engineers who were actively working to save it. But they had kept it standing just long enough. The foothold into Germany was secure. So the Remagen breakthrough really illustrates how the rigid, heavily debated plans of generals like Montgomery and even Hodges himself were ultimately completely reshaped by the split-second courage of a few soldiers on a crumbling bridge. It forces us to ask, in the grand design of history, how much is dictated by the master plan from the top down, and how much is decided by a sergeant losing his helmet in a 1,300-foot sprint into the unknown? Thanks so much for exploring this remarkable piece of history with me today.